The dust devil spun across the barren yard like a ghost dancing over forgotten dreams, and Emma Fairchild stood at the edge of the property line staring at the broken windmill that rose against the copper sky like a monument to abandonment. She had walked 17 miles from the stagecoach station in Bodie, California, her boots worn through at the heels, her dress covered in the fine powder that seemed to coat everything in this God-forsaken corner of the world. It was August of 1881, and the heat pressed down on the high desert valley with the weight of divine judgment. She clutched the deed to her uncle's property in one hand, the paper already limp with her sweat, and wondered what madness had brought her west when she could have stayed in Philadelphia and married the banker's son like her mother had begged. The house was smaller than she had imagined from her uncle's letters, a weathered structure of sun-bleached wood that leaned slightly to the east, as though tired of standing upright. The windmill rose behind it, its blades frozen at odd angles, some missing entirely, the whole structure listing like a drunk trying to find his way home. Emma walked forward slowly, her eyes scanning the property for any sign of life. Uncle Theodore had died 3 months ago, according to the lawyer's letter that had found her in Pennsylvania. Heart failure, they said, though Emma suspected it was loneliness that had killed him. He had never married, never had children, and when the mine work dried up in Bodie, he had tried his hand at ranching on this small parcel of land 5 miles south of town. The front door hung open on rusted hinges, and Emma stepped inside cautiously. The interior was dim and stifling, but relatively clean. Her uncle had been a neat man, at least. A single room served as kitchen and living space, with a narrow bed against one wall and a pot-bellied stove in the corner. A ladder led up to a small loft where Emma could see a rolled mattress and some wooden crates. She set down her carpetbag and walked back outside, needing air and space to think. That was when she noticed the rider approaching from the south, a dark figure against the bright landscape moving at an easy lope. Emma shaded her eyes and watched him come, her heart beating faster despite herself. She was alone out here, miles from town, and she had no weapon except a small knife in her bag. The rider drew closer, and she could make out details now. A tall man on a buckskin horse, wearing a dusty black hat and vest over a faded blue shirt. He sat his saddle with the easy grace of someone born to it, and as he approached, he slowed his horse to a walk. "Afternoon," he called out, touching the brim of his hat. His voice was deep and rough like gravel underfoot. "Did not expect to see anyone out here." Emma straightened her spine and lifted her chin. "This is my property. My uncle left it to me." The rider brought his horse to a stop about 10 feet away and studied her with eyes that were startling in their intensity. They were gray-green, like the sage that dotted the hills, and they took in every detail of her appearance with a directness that made her want to smooth her hair and dust off her dress. He was younger than she had first thought, probably no more than 25 or 26, with a strong jaw shadowed by several days' growth of beard and sun-darkened skin that spoke of years spent outdoors. "You would be Theodore's niece, then," he said. It was not quite a question. He mentioned he had family back east. "Name is Mason Everett. My land borders yours to the south." Emma Fairchild. She did not offer her hand, and he did not dismount. They studied each other across the dusty yard while his horse stamped and swished its tail at flies. "Your uncle was a good man," Mason said after a moment. "I am sorry for your loss. Thank you." Emma glanced back at the house, then at the broken windmill. "Did you know him well?" "Well enough. We helped each other out when needed. That is how it works out here." Mason followed her gaze to the windmill, and something shifted in his expression. "That thing has been broken for near about 2 years. Theodore tried to fix it a few times, but he did not have the strength for climbing anymore. Bad heart, though he would not admit it. Is there water otherwise? Emma asked, forcing herself to be practical. She had little money left, barely enough to get her through a month if she was careful, and she needed to know what she was working with. There is a hand pump by the house for drinking water. The windmill fed the stock tank for animals. Mason gestured toward a large metal tank that Emma had not noticed before, sitting dry and rusted near the remnants of a corral. Without it working, you cannot keep livestock. The hand pump cannot supply enough. Emma looked at the windmill again, really looked at it. The tower stood perhaps 30 feet high, a skeletal framework of wood and metal. The fan blades at the top were meant to catch the wind and turn a pump shaft that would draw water from deep underground. She could see the broken gears and the bent vanes from where she stood. It looked impossibly complicated and dangerous. "Can it be fixed?" she asked. Mason pushed his hat back slightly, revealing sweat-damp hair the color of old wheat. "With the right parts and knowledge, I suppose. It would take someone who knows what they are doing, though. And someone with no fear of heights. How much would it cost to hire someone?" He shook his head slowly. "There is no one in Bodie who does that kind of work anymore. You would have to send to Carson City or maybe San Francisco for a specialist. Cost you more than the place is worth, most likely." Emma felt something sink in her chest. She had counted on this land being functional, had imagined herself learning to manage it, maybe hiring help, making something of the inheritance her uncle had left her. Without water for animals, the land was nearly worthless. She could try to sell it, but who would buy property with a broken windmill and no stock? "I see," she said quietly. "Thank you for the information." Mason sat his horse a moment longer, and Emma had the sense he wanted to say something else. Instead, he simply nodded and touched his hat brim again. "If you need anything, my place is about 3 miles south. Follow the wagon ruts. Anyone in town can tell you where to find me if needed." He turned his horse and rode away, and Emma stood in the yard watching him disappear into the shimmer of heat that rose from the desert floor. When he was gone, she walked slowly to the base of the windmill and looked up. The sun blazed behind it, turning the metal struts into black lines against the glare. She reached out and touched one of the support beams. It was hot enough to burn, and rough with rust and old paint. Emma Fairchild had not crossed half the continent to give up at the first obstacle. She had left behind everything she knew, turned down a marriage proposal that would have secured her future, and used the last of her savings to make this journey. Her mother had wept and called her foolish. Her sisters had looked at her with pity mixed with envy. But Emma had known, with a certainty that surprised her, that she could not live the life that had been planned for her. She could not be the banker's wife who hosted tea parties and bore children, and faded slowly into respectable invisibility. She walked around the windmill tower, examining it from all sides. The ladder rungs that climbed the structure looked mostly intact, though some were clearly rusted through. The platform at the top, where the mechanism lived, seemed solid enough from down here. Emma had never been afraid of heights. As a child, she had climbed every tree in her neighborhood, much to her mother's horror. She had scaled the trellis outside her bedroom window more times than she could count, but that had been when she was young and foolish. She was 22 now, a grown woman, and the windmill was far higher than any tree she had ever climbed. Emma went inside and found some bread and dried meat in her uncle's cupboard. She ate mechanically, not tasting the food, her mind working through possibilities. She had no money to hire specialists. She had no knowledge of how windmills worked. But she had a functioning brain and 2 good hands, and there had to be some way to understand the mechanism. Her uncle had been a miner, not an engineer, and he had built this windmill himself using plans ordered from a catalog. If he could build it, surely she could figure out how to fix it. That evening, as the heat finally began to release its grip on the land, Emma searched the house more thoroughly. She found a wooden crate under the bed filled with papers and journals. Among them was a folded set of plans for the windmill, the paper yellowed and torn at the creases, but still legible. Emma spread them out on the table and studied them by lamplight, tracing the lines with her finger, trying to understand how each piece connected to the next. The wind picked up after dark, and Emma could hear the broken windmill creaking and groaning like a wounded animal. She lay in her uncle's bed, too tired to climb to the loft, and stared at the ceiling while the structure's sounds filled the night. She thought about Mason Everett on his horse, the way he had looked at her with those sage-colored eyes. She thought about the distance in his expression when he talked about the windmill, as though he had given up on it long ago. She thought about her mother in Philadelphia, probably sitting in the parlor with her needlework, certain that Emma would be home within the month, defeated by the harsh realities of the West. Emma fell asleep with her jaw set in determination. She woke before dawn, dressed in her oldest dress and a pair of her uncle's work gloves she found hanging by the door, and approached the windmill in the gray light of morning. The metal was cool now, almost pleasant to touch. She tested the first ladder rung carefully, putting half her weight on it, then all of it. It held. She climbed to the second rung, then the third. The ground dropped away beneath her, and her heart began to beat faster, but it was excitement as much as fear. Emma climbed steadily, testing each rung before trusting it with her weight. About halfway up, she made the mistake of looking down and had to close her eyes for a moment, pressing her forehead against the cool metal of the tower. The world spun slightly, and she could feel the wind pushing at her skirts, trying to peel her away from the structure. She breathed deeply, then continued climbing. The platform at the top was about 6 feet square, with a waist-high railing around 3 sides. The fourth side held the massive wheel of blades, currently motionless, and beneath it, the housing that contained the gears and pump shaft. Emma pulled herself onto the platform and sat for a moment, catching her breath. Her arms trembled with effort, and sweat ran down her back despite the morning cool, but the view was extraordinary. From up here, she could see for miles in every direction. The desert stretched out in shades of gold and brown and purple, punctuated by sage and scrub brush, and the occasional dark line of cottonwoods marking a hidden water source. To the north, she could just make out the buildings of Bodie, huddled in the hills like a collection of children's blocks. To the south, she saw a distant cluster of structures that must be Mason Everett's ranch. And everywhere, the mountains rose up against the sky, their peaks still holding snow even in August. Emma stood carefully and examined the mechanism. Several of the fan blades were cracked or missing entirely, which explained why the wheel could not turn properly in the wind. The main shaft that connected the fan wheel to the pump below was bent, probably from the stress of the imbalanced blades. And inside the gear housing, which she opened carefully, the gears themselves were worn and misaligned. She spent an hour up there, studying how everything fit together, comparing what she saw to the plans she had memorized. The sun rose higher and the platform began to heat up, but Emma barely noticed. She was lost in the puzzle of it, understanding now how the wind's energy transferred through the system, how the spinning blades turned the gears which drove the pump shaft, which pulled water from deep in the earth. It was elegant in its simplicity once you understood the principles. Finally, when the heat became truly oppressive, Emma climbed down. Her hands were cramped and sore, her legs shaking with fatigue, but her mind was racing. She needed new blades or materials to repair the old ones. She needed to straighten the main shaft somehow, or replace it. She needed tools she did not have and knowledge she was still acquiring, but it was possible. The task was not impossible. Emma walked the 3 miles into Bodie that afternoon, ignoring the blisters forming on her feet. The town was a strange mixture of permanence and impermanence, with some buildings solidly built of brick and stone while others were clearly temporary structures thrown up during the mining boom of the 1870s. The boom had faded, but Bodie still clung to life, supported by a few working minds and the stubborn determination of people who had nowhere else to go. She found the general store and spent 20 minutes walking the aisles, examining what was available. The owner, a balding man with suspicious eyes, watched her the whole time but said nothing until she approached his counter. "Can I help you find something, miss?" "I need materials to repair a windmill," Emma said. "Sheet metal if you have it, strong wood for blades, tools for metalworking." The man's eyebrows rose. "That is not usual work for a woman." "Nevertheless, that is what I need." He showed her what he had, which was less than she hoped for but more than nothing. The prices made her wince, but she bought a few basic tools and some materials she thought she could use. She also bought more food, fabric for new work clothes, and a wide-brimmed hat to protect her from the sun. "You are Theodore Fairchild's niece," the store owner said as he wrapped her purchases. It was not a question. "Yes. Heard you had come west to claim his place." "Heard you were staying out there alone." Emma met his eyes steadily. "Is that a problem?" he shrugged. "Not my business, but folks will talk. A young woman alone 5 miles from town, it is not common." "I imagine a lot of things are not common until someone does them," Emma said, taking her parcels. "Thank you for your help." She stopped at the post office and mailed a brief letter to her mother, giving her new address and assuring her that she was safe and well. She did not mention the broken windmill or the isolation or the enormous task she had set herself. There was no point in giving her mother more ammunition for the argument that Emma should come home. The walk back to the ranch took longer, burdened as she was with her purchases. The sun beat down mercilessly, and Emma had to stop several times to rest in the shade of scattered rocks. She was still a mile from home when she heard hoofbeats behind her and turned to see Mason Everett approaching on his buckskin horse, leading a gray mare on a lead rope. He drew up beside her and looked down at her flushed face and her armload of parcels. "You walk to town." "I do not have a horse." "That is a 6-mile round trip in this heat." He dismounted in one fluid motion and took the heavy parcels from her arms before she could protest. He tied them securely to his saddle, then gestured to the gray mare. "She is gentle. She can carry you home." "I cannot accept. You are already exhausted, Miss Fairchild. Do not let pride make you foolish." His voice was blunt but not unkind. "The desert will kill you if you are not careful. Save your strength for battles that matter." Emma wanted to argue, but he was right. Her legs were trembling and she still had a mile to go. She allowed him to help her onto the mare, and they set off together at a walk, Mason leading both horses on foot. They traveled in silence for a while, the only sounds the horses' hooves and the wind moving through the sage. Finally, Emma said, "What were you doing on the road to town?" "Coming to check on you, actually." Mason glanced up at her. "Wanted to make sure you had not died of stubbornness yet." Despite herself, Emma smiled. "I am harder to kill than that. I am beginning to see that." He shifted the parcels on his saddle. "What did you buy, materials and tools? I am going to fix the windmill." Mason stopped walking and turned to stare at her. "You are going to what?" "Fix the windmill. I climbed up this morning and examined the mechanism. I think I can repair it." "You climbed the windmill?" His voice was flat with disbelief. That broken tower, 30 feet high with rusted rungs and no safety line. The rungs were mostly sound. I tested them. Mostly sound. Mason took off his hat and ran his hand through his hair, and Emma saw something flicker across his face that might have been anger or might have been fear. Miss Fairchild, that is insane. One wrong step, one broken rung, and you would fall to your death. For what? A piece of machinery that is not worth fixing. It is worth fixing to me, Emma said quietly. Without it, this land cannot support livestock. Without livestock, the land is worthless. I have nowhere else to go, Mr. Everett. This is what I have, and I intend to make it work. He stared at her for a long moment, and Emma stared back, refusing to look away. Finally, Mason shook his head and put his hat back on. You are either the bravest woman I have ever met or the most foolish. I have not decided which. Perhaps I am both. They continued walking, and Emma thought the conversation was over. But after another few minutes of silence, Mason said, If you are determined to do this fool thing, at least let me help. I know something about metalwork, and I can handle the high climbing. There is no reason for you to risk breaking your neck. I cannot pay you. I am not asking for payment. Your uncle was my neighbor and my friend. I should have fixed that damned windmill for him years ago, but I kept putting it off, thinking there was time. His voice roughened. There was not time, so let me help you now. Consider it a debt paid. Emma studied the back of his head, the strong line of his shoulders under the faded shirt, the easy way he moved even weighted down with her parcels. Why did you not fix it before, if you knew he needed it? Mason was quiet for so long that Emma thought he would not answer. Finally, he said, Fear, I suppose. Heights never bothered me when I was younger, but a few years back, I took a bad fall from a spooked horse. Broke 3 ribs in my left arm. While I was healing, I got it in my head that I was not invincible after all. Started seeing danger everywhere. That windmill scared me, truth be told. The height of it, the way it creaked and swayed. So I made excuses. Said I was too busy, said Theodore should hire a professional. And then he died, and the windmill was still broken. There was such raw honesty in his words that Emma felt something shift in her chest. I am sorry, she said softly. That must be a heavy burden to carry. It is my burden, not yours. But if you will let me help now, maybe I can set down some of that weight. All right, Emma said. Yes, I would be grateful for your help. They reached her uncle's property as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. Mason helped her down from the mare and unloaded her parcels, carrying them into the house without being asked. Emma followed, suddenly aware of how small and shabby the place must look to him. But Mason did not seem to notice or care. He set the parcels on the table and turned to her. I will come by tomorrow morning early, before it gets too hot. We can work on the windmill for a few hours, then take a break during the worst heat, then work again in the evening if needed. That is how we will have to do it in stages, unless you want to collapse from heat stroke. That sounds reasonable. Mason moved toward the door, then paused. Miss Fairchild, what you are doing here, trying to make this place work on your own, it is remarkable. Foolish, maybe, but remarkable. I want you to know that. Before Emma could respond, he was gone, riding south on his buckskin with the gray mare trailing behind. Emma stood in the doorway and watched until he disappeared from sight, her hand pressed against her chest where her heart was beating too fast. That night, she laid out her tools and materials and studied the windmill plans again by lamplight. But her mind kept drifting to Mason Everett, to the way he sat his horse, to the roughness in his voice when he talked about her uncle. She thought about the fear he had admitted to, the vulnerability of that confession. She thought about his hands, strong and scarred, and wondered what it would feel like if he touched her. Emma shook her head sharply, trying to clear away such thoughts. She had not come west for romance. She had come for independence, for the chance to build something of her own. Getting tangled up with a cowboy neighbor was not part of the plan, but when she finally fell asleep, she dreamed of gray-green eyes and a voice like gravel underfoot, and she woke with the sun feeling restless and strange. Mason arrived just after dawn, riding out of the pearl-colored light with a bag of tools tied to his saddle and a coiled rope over his shoulder. Emma was already awake, dressed in a split skirt she had sewn the night before from her uncle's old work pants. It was scandalous by Philadelphia standards, but practical for climbing and working. Mason's eyes widened slightly when he saw her, but he said nothing about her unconventional attire. "I brought a safety line," he said, holding up the rope, "and some additional tools. I have been thinking about what needs doing." Together, they approached the windmill. The morning was still cool, the metal almost pleasant to touch. Emma showed Mason what she had observed the day before, pointing out the damaged blades and the bent shaft. He listened carefully, his eyes following her gestures, and she could see him calculating and planning. "The blades we can repair or remake," he said. "The shaft is trickier. We will need to remove it entirely, heat it, and straighten it with hammers. I have a forge at my place we can use." "How do we remove it?" "That is the hard part. Someone has to climb up there and disconnect it from both the fan wheel and the pump mechanism. It is heavy and awkward and dangerous as hell." "I will do it," Emma said immediately. "We will both do it," Mason corrected. "That platform can hold 2 people if we are careful. I said I would help, Miss Fairchild, and I meant it." They spent the next hour on the ground preparing. Mason showed Emma how to tie the safety rope around her waist, how to secure it to the windmill structure so that if she fell, the rope would catch her. He tested every knot twice, his movements quick and sure. Then he rigged himself with a second rope, and they began to climb. Emma went first, with Mason following close behind. She was acutely aware of his presence below her, of his eyes on her as she climbed. When she reached the platform, she pulled herself over the railing and immediately turned to help Mason up. Their hands clasped briefly, and Emma felt the calluses on his palms, the strength in his fingers. He swung onto the platform beside her, and suddenly the space felt much smaller. "All right," Mason said, his voice carefully neutral. "Show me what you found." They worked together in the growing heat, examining the mechanism, discussing the best approach. Mason pointed out details Emma had missed, showed her tricks for loosening rusted bolts, explained how the weight distribution worked. His knowledge was practical and hard-won, learned from years of maintaining his own ranch equipment. Emma absorbed everything like parched earth drinking rain. By the time the sun was high enough to make the platform unbearable, they had removed 2 of the damaged blades and loosened the bolts holding the main shaft in place. They climbed down carefully, both of them sweat-soaked and exhausted, and retreated to the shade of the house. Emma brought out water and cold beans, and they ate in comfortable silence. Mason sat with his back against the house wall, his hat tipped forward to shade his face, and Emma found herself watching him. There was something solid about him, something reliable. He did not talk just to fill silence. He did not make promises he could not keep. He simply did the work that needed doing and asked for nothing in return. "Why did you stay out here?" Emma asked suddenly. "After the mine started failing, most people left Bodie. Why did you choose to stay?" Mason pushed his hat back and looked at her. "I like the space, the quiet. In town, there are too many people, too many opinions about how a man should live his life. Out here, I can make my own choices, succeed or fail by my own effort. That matters to me." "I understand that," Emma said softly. "That is why I came west. My mother wanted me to marry well, to be a proper lady. But I could not breathe in that life. Every day felt like wearing a corset laced too tight. And now Now I have bruises and blisters, and I am covered in dust and rust, and I have never felt more alive." Mason smiled, a real smile that transformed his face, and Emma's breath caught. He was beautiful when he smiled, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with conventional handsomeness and everything to do with authenticity. They rested through the worst heat of midday, and then went back to work in the late afternoon. This time, they focused on the fan blades, measuring and marking where new wood needed to be cut, discussing how to attach the replacement pieces so they would be strong enough to withstand the wind's force. Mason proved to be patient and skilled, showing Emma how to measure twice and cut once, how to test the balance of each blade so the wheel would turn evenly. As the sun set in a glory of orange and purple, Emma realized she was happy. Genuinely, deeply happy in a way she had not been in years. Her hands hurt and her shoulders ached, and she was so tired she could barely stand, but she felt purposeful. She felt competent, and she felt something else too, something warm and bright that sparked in her chest whenever Mason looked at her or smiled or spoke her name. Over the following days, they fell into a rhythm. Mason would arrive at dawn and they would work until midday, then rest through the worst heat, then work again until dark. Slowly, the windmill began to transform. They repaired the fan blades one by one, replacing broken pieces with new wood that Mason carefully shaped and sanded. They removed the bent shaft and hauled it to Mason's ranch, where they spent a sweating afternoon heating the metal in his forge and hammering it straight. They cleaned and realigned the gears, replacing those too worn to function. And as they worked, they talked. Emma told Mason about Philadelphia, about her family, about the suffocating expectations that had driven her west. Mason told her about growing up in Nevada, about coming to California as a young man seeking his fortune, about staying even when the fortune never materialized because he had found something better, a life that fit him. Emma learned that Mason was 26, that he had never been married, though he had been engaged once to a woman in Virginia City, who had ultimately decided she could not live in such isolation. She learned that he raised cattle and horses on his ranch, barely making enough to get by, but refusing to give up. She learned that he had a wry sense of humor and a deep well of patience, and a tendency to push himself too hard, skipping meals and working too long because he hated to leave tasks unfinished. Mason learned that Emma was 22, that she had attended a women's seminary and scandalized her teachers by arguing about politics and science. He learned that she read voraciously, anything she could get her hands on, and that she had a gift for understanding mechanical systems. He learned that she was stubborn and brave and sometimes reckless, but never foolish. There was always a reason behind her choices, even if others could not see it. On the 10th day of their work together, they finally climbed up to the platform to install the straightened shaft. It was delicate, difficult work, requiring them to work in perfect coordination. Mason held the heavy shaft in place while Emma secured the bolts, her fingers cramping with the effort. They were pressed close together on the small platform, Mason's chest against her shoulder, his breath warm on her neck. Emma could smell him, sweat and leather and something else, something essentially him. Her hands trembled, and not from exertion. "Steady," Mason murmured, his voice low and close to her ear. "You are doing fine. 2 more bolts." Emma forced herself to focus, to ignore the way her body responded to his nearness. She tightened the second to last bolt, then the final one. When she was done, she sat back on her heels and Mason carefully lowered the shaft into place. It fit perfectly, the gears engaging with a satisfying click. "We did it," Emma whispered. "Mason, we actually did it." He turned to look at her, and their faces were inches apart. Emma could see gold flecks in his gray-green eyes, could see a small scar on his chin she had never noticed before. Time seemed to slow, and she saw him start to lean forward, saw his gaze drop to her lips. Then a gust of wind caught the newly repaired fan wheel and it jerked hard, causing the whole platform to shake. They both grabbed the railing and the moment shattered. "We should go down," Mason said, his voice rough. "Test it from the ground." They climbed down in silence, and Emma's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. They stood in the yard and watched as the wind caught the blades again. This time, instead of jerking and creaking, the wheel began to turn. Slowly at first, then faster, the blades spinning in a great circle against the sky. Below, the pump shaft began to move, and after a moment, water began to flow from the pipe into the stock tank. Emma let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "It works! Oh God, Mason, it works!" She turned to him, meaning to shake his hand or thank him, but instead found herself throwing her arms around his neck. For a heartbeat, he stood frozen, and then his arms came around her waist, holding her tight. They stood like that, wrapped together, while the windmill turned above them and water flowed into the tank and the desert wind sang its ancient song. Finally, Emma pulled back, suddenly aware of the impropriety of her action. "I am sorry. I did not mean to be so forward." "Do not apologize," Mason said quietly. His hands were still on her waist, and he was looking at her with such intensity that Emma felt heat rise in her face. "Emma, I need to tell you something." Her heart stuttered at his use of her first name. "What is it?" "These past days, working with you, getting to know you, I have been trying to convince myself that what I am feeling is just friendship, neighborly concern, but I cannot lie to myself anymore." He took a breath. "I am falling in love with you. Maybe I have been since the moment I rode up and saw you standing in this yard, dusty and determined and completely unafraid. And I know I should not say this, know it is too soon and may be unwelcome, but I cannot keep it inside any longer." Emma stared at him, her mind reeling. She thought about the past 10 days, about the way her heart had jumped every morning when she saw him riding up, about the way she had memorized every detail of his face, about the way she felt most herself when they were together. She thought about the life she had left behind, the safe and respectable future she had rejected, and she thought about the life stretching before her now, full of uncertainty and hardship and possibility. "It is not unwelcome," she said softly. "Mason, I feel the same. I have been trying not to, trying to focus on the work and the land and proving that I could make it on my own. But the truth is, I do not want to make it alone, not if making it can include you." His hands tightened on her waist, and then he was kissing her. It was not a gentle kiss, not tentative or questioning. It was fierce and hungry, full of days of restraint breaking apart. Emma kissed him back with equal intensity, her fingers tangling in his hair, her body pressed against his. She felt the strength of him, the solidness, and something inside her that had been tightly wound began to unfurl. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Mason rested his forehead against hers. "Emma, I do not have much to offer you. My ranch is barely profitable, and this land of yours will take years to build up to something sustainable. But if you will have me, I swear I will work every day to make you happy. I will never ask you to be anything other than who you are." "That is everything I want," Emma said. "I did not come west looking for love, but I found it anyway. I found you." They kissed again, softer this time, and the windmill turned above them, a monument no longer to abandonment but to perseverance and partnership. That night, Mason rode home only after Emma insisted he needed to tend to his own animals. She stood in the doorway and watched him disappear into the darkness, touching her fingers to her lips and marveling at how completely her life had changed in less than 2 weeks. She was in love with a cowboy. She was going to build a life in the desert. None of it was what she had planned, but all of it felt absolutely right. Over the next weeks, Emma and Mason worked to build up her ranch. They repaired the corrals, replaced rotted fence posts, and negotiated with a rancher outside Bodie for a small herd of cattle. Emma used the last of her savings to purchase 10 head, just enough to start, and Mason donated 2 of his horses to her stock. They worked from dawn to dusk, and Emma learned more about ranching in those weeks than she had thought possible. She also learned about Mason. She learned that he woke before dawn every morning and watched the sunrise while drinking bitter black coffee. She learned that he could not sing to save his life, but did so anyway when he worked, off-key renditions of old trail songs that made her laugh. She learned that he had a fear of spiders but would never admit it, and that his favorite meal was bread and honey, and that he thought she was the most beautiful woman in the world even when she was covered in dust and smelled like cattle. Emma fell more in love with him every day. She loved his steadiness, his quiet strength, the way he treated her as an equal partner in every decision. He never patronized her or suggested that something was too difficult for a woman. When she had ideas, he listened carefully and evaluated them on their merit. When she made mistakes, he helped her fix them without making her feel foolish. And when she succeeded, he celebrated with a pride that made her heart swell. In early September, Mason asked Emma to marry him. They were fixing a section of fence in the late afternoon, working side by side in comfortable silence, when he suddenly set down his tools and turned to her. "Emma, I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I want to combine our ranches, build something together that is bigger than what either of us could do alone. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep with you in my arms every night. Will you marry me?" Emma looked at him standing in the golden light, his hat in his hands, his eyes full of hope and love and a little bit of fear. She thought about how far she had come, how much she had changed. The woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in August would barely recognize the woman she had become. That woman had been running from something. This woman had found what she was running toward. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, Mason, I will marry you." He swept her up in his arms and spun her around, both of them laughing like children. When he set her down, he kissed her thoroughly, and Emma felt happiness fill every corner of her being. They were married 3 weeks later in Bodie's small church, with half the town in attendance. Emma wore a simple dress of blue calico that she had sewn herself, with wildflowers in her hair that Mason had picked that morning. Mason wore his Sunday best, a black suit that he clearly did not wear often, and he could not stop smiling. The minister performed the brief ceremony, and when he pronounced them husband and wife, Mason kissed Emma with such tenderness that several of the older women in attendance sighed audibly. After the ceremony, there was a celebration at the town hall, with music and dancing and more food than Emma had seen in months. The people of Bodie had been skeptical of her at first, the Eastern woman who thought she could run a ranch alone. But over the past weeks, as word spread about the Windmill and her determination, their skepticism had turned to respect. Now they welcomed her as one of their own, as Mason Everett's wife, as a woman who had proven she belonged in this hard land. Emma danced with Mason until her feet hurt, and then they slipped away into the night, riding together on his buckskin horse toward their future. They had decided to live on Emma's property, at least initially, since the house was closer to town and the windmill was the heart of their water system. Mason would gradually move his herd north, and they would combine operations, building their ranch into something that could sustain them. On their wedding night, in the small house that had been her uncle's. Mason carried Emma over the threshold and set her down gently in the lamplight. They had waited, old-fashioned in that way despite their forward thinking in others, and now the anticipation of finally being together made Emma's hands shake as she began to unbutton her dress. Mason stopped her gently, covering her hands with his. "Let me," he said softly. He undressed her slowly, reverently, his eyes full of wonder as each layer fell away. When she stood before him in only her chemise and petticoats, Emma reached for him, unbuttoning his shirt with trembling fingers. She had never done this before, had never been with a man, and she was nervous but not afraid. This was Mason, her husband, the man she loved. Whatever they discovered together would be right. They came together on the narrow bed, their bodies fitting as perfectly as their hearts. Mason was gentle and patient, guiding Emma through her nervousness into pleasure she had not imagined possible. They moved together in the lamplight, and Emma felt as though she was discovering a whole new language, one spoken in touches and sighs and the joining of two bodies into one. When they finally lay tangled together afterward, sweaty and sated, Emma felt tears on her cheeks. "Did I hurt you?" Mason asked immediately, his voice full of concern. "No," Emma whispered. "No, I am just happy, so incredibly happy." He pulled her closer, and she rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Outside, the windmill turned in the night breeze, the rhythmic creak a lullaby that sang them to sleep. The months that followed were hard but happy. Fall came to the high desert, bringing cooler temperatures and occasional rain. Emma and Mason worked together to prepare for winter, building up their hay stores, reinforcing the barn, making sure every fence line was secure. They moved Mason's cattle north in stages, combining the herds until they had nearly 40 head. It was still a small operation, but it was growing. Emma proved to be a natural rancher. She had a good eye for cattle, could spot sickness or injury quickly, and had a gentle way with animals that earned their trust. She also proved to be an excellent manager, keeping careful records of expenses and income, planning for the future in ways that Mason admitted he had never done. Together, they were stronger than either had been alone. Winter came hard that year, with heavy snows that isolated them for weeks at a time, but Emma did not mind the isolation. She and Mason were snug in their small house, with plenty of wood for the stove and food put by. They spent long evenings reading aloud to each other, Emma sharing books she had brought from Philadelphia, and Mason teaching her card games he had learned in mining camps. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, learning the landscape of each other's minds as thoroughly as they knew each other's bodies on Christmas morning. Emma woke to find Mason already up, stoking the fire. She joined him, wrapped in a blanket, and they sat together watching the flames dance. "I have something for you," Mason said. He pulled out a small package wrapped in brown paper and handed it to her. Emma opened it carefully to find a beautiful leather journal, the cover tooled with an intricate design of windmill and mountains. "Mason, it is beautiful. I thought you could use it to write down everything that happens here. Your story, our story. So that someday, when we are old, we can look back and remember how it all began." Emma felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you. I love it." She set the journal aside carefully and reached for the package she had hidden under the bed. "I have something for you, too." Inside the package was a shirt she had sewn from fabric she had carefully saved for, dyed a deep blue that matched his eyes. Mason held it up, and she could see emotion on his face. "You made this." "I did. I know it is not much, but it is everything," he interrupted. "Emma, it is perfect." They spent the rest of Christmas Day in blissful laziness, cooking a simple meal together and making love in the afternoon light. As the sun set, Emma wrote the first entry in her new journal, documenting the day and the gift and the overwhelming sense of gratitude she felt for this life she had found. Spring arrived slowly, the snow melting in fits and starts, the land emerging brown and muddy. But with the spring came green shoots, and the return of migrating birds and the sense of renewal that always accompanied the changing seasons. Emma and Mason began planning for the year ahead, deciding which pastures to use, when to breed the cattle, what improvements to make to the property. In April, Emma realized her monthly courses had not come. At first, she told herself it was the hard work, the change in diet, the stress of adjusting to ranch life. But when another month passed, she could not deny the truth any longer. She was pregnant. Emma told Mason one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. She had worried about his reaction, wondered if he would think it was too soon, if he would be concerned about adding another mouth to feed when they were still building up the ranch. But Mason's face transformed with joy. He pulled her into his arms and held her so tight she could barely breathe. "A baby," he whispered. "Emma, we are going to have a baby. Are you happy?" she asked, needing to hear it. "Happy does not even begin to cover it. I am over the moon. I am thrilled beyond words." He pulled back to look at her, his hands cupping her face. "Are you happy?" "I am terrified," Emma admitted, "and excited, and yes, happy, so happy." They spent the evening making plans, talking about names and where to put a cradle, and how they would manage the work of the ranch with a baby to care for. Mason was adamant that Emma take things easier, that she not push herself too hard. Emma rolled her eyes at his protectiveness, but secretly loved it. As her pregnancy progressed, Emma found herself thinking often about her mother, about her sisters, about the life she had left behind. She wrote long letters home, telling them about Mason, about the ranch, about the baby coming. Her mother wrote back with advice and concern, urging Emma to come home for the birth, to have the baby in Philadelphia where there were proper doctors. But Emma refused. This was her home now, and her child would be born here, in this land she and Mason were building together. In late November, on a cold, clear night with stars blazing overhead, Emma went into labor. Mason rode through the darkness to fetch the midwife from Bodie, a capable woman named Mrs. Chen, who had delivered half the babies in the county. She arrived to find Emma pacing the small house, breathing through contractions, and immediately took charge. The labor was long and hard. Emma had known it would be, but knowing did not make it easier. She gritted her teeth through the pain, refusing to scream, clutching Mason's hand so hard she thought she might break his bones. Mason stayed with her the whole time, despite Mrs. Chen's suggestion that men usually waited outside. He wiped Emma's face with cool cloths, whispered encouragement, and let her squeeze his hand until it was numb. Just before dawn, as the sky was beginning to lighten, Emma gave birth to a daughter. The baby came into the world wailing, her face red and furious, her tiny fists waving. Mrs. Chen cleaned her quickly and placed her on Emma's chest, and Emma looked down at her daughter's face and felt her heart expand in ways she had not known were possible. "She is perfect," Emma whispered. "Mason, look at her. She is absolutely perfect." Mason was crying openly, tears streaming down his face as he touched his daughter's tiny hand with one finger. "She is beautiful, just like her mother." They named her Sarah Rose Everett, after Mason's mother and Emma's grandmother. Sarah had Mason's eyes and Emma's dark hair, and from her first day, she displayed a fierce determination that made both parents laugh. She wanted what she wanted when she wanted it, and she made her displeasure known loudly when denied. The months after Sarah's birth were a blur of sleepless nights and endless feedings, and a love so overwhelming it sometimes brought Emma to tears. She and Mason took turns walking the floor with Sarah when she would not sleep, took turns getting up for night feedings, worked together to manage both the baby and the ranch. It was exhausting and frustrating, and the most rewarding thing Emma had ever done. Spring came again, Sarah's first spring, and Emma carried her daughter outside to see the windmill turning, the cattle grazing, the desert coming alive with wildflowers. "This is your home," she whispered to Sarah. "This land your father and I are building for you. Someday it will be yours." As Sarah grew from an infant to a toddler, Emma and Mason's ranch grew too. They added to their herd, expanded their grazing land by leasing adjacent parcels, and built a larger barn. The windmill Mason and Emma had repaired together continued to turn faithfully, providing water for their growing operation. It became a landmark in the area, visible for miles, and people called their place the Windmill Ranch. When Sarah was 3, Emma became pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier and the birth faster. They had a son they named Michael Theodore Everett, after Mason's father and Emma's uncle. Michael was quieter than his sister, more contemplative but no less determined. Sarah took to her role as big sister with enthusiasm, trying to help with everything and getting underfoot in the process. Emma documented it all in the journal Mason had given her that first Christmas. She wrote about the good days and the hard days, about droughts that tested them and seasons of plenty that rewarded their hard work. She wrote about watching Mason teach Sarah to ride, about Michael's first words, about the way her children's laughter filled the house that had once seemed so empty. She wrote about still falling in love with Mason every day, about the way he could make her laugh even when she was exhausted, about the partnership they had built that was stronger than she had ever imagined. The years passed, and the Windmill Ranch became one of the most successful operations in the area. Emma and Mason's reputation for fair dealing and quality cattle spread, and they found themselves able to hire hands to help with the work. They built a larger house, though they kept the original building as a guest house, unable to let go of the place where their story had begun. Sarah grew into a capable young woman who could ride and rope as well as any man, and who had inherited her mother's gift for mechanics. She kept the windmill running smoothly, understanding its quirks and needs. Michael became the ranch's manager, with a head for figures and planning that rivaled his mother's. Together, the Everett family built something that would last. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Mason took Emma up to the windmill platform, climbing the ladder they had climbed together so many times before. The structure was as solid as ever, well-maintained and reliable. They stood on the platform as the sun set, looking out over land that was entirely theirs now, land they had earned with sweat and determination and love. "You ever regret it?" Mason asked. "Leaving Philadelphia, coming west, choosing this hard life?" Emma leaned into him, his arm around her waist, and smiled. "Not for a single moment. This is exactly where I was meant to be, with you, building this." "I fell in love with you the moment I saw you climb this windmill," Mason said. "You were so fierce, so determined, so completely unafraid. And then you got it turning again, got this whole place turning again, and I knew I wanted to spend the rest of my life with you." "You helped me," Emma reminded him. "We did it together." "That is how everything good in my life has happened," Mason said. "Together with you." They kissed as the sun dropped below the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose and purple. Below them, the ranch spread out like a promise kept. The windmill turned steadily, its rhythm as constant as their love, and in the distance, they could hear their children's voices calling them to dinner. Emma thought about the young woman she had been, desperate and determined, stepping off that stagecoach in Bodie with nothing but a deed and a dream. She thought about the broken windmill that had seemed like such an insurmountable obstacle, and the cowboy who had ridden up and changed everything. She thought about all the moments that had led her here, to this platform, to this man, to this life that was harder and richer and more beautiful than anything she could have imagined. "I love you," she said simply. "Thank you for building this life with me." "Thank you for letting me," Mason replied. "Thank you for climbing my broken windmill and setting it turning. Thank you for setting my whole world turning." They climbed down together as the stars began to emerge, their hands clasped, their steps sure. They had built something lasting here, something that would endure long after they were gone. Not just a ranch, but a family, a legacy, a love story that would be told for generations. That night, lying in bed with Mason's arms around her, Emma opened her journal and wrote by lamplight. She wrote about the anniversary, about the climb to the windmill platform, about the overwhelming gratitude she felt for every twist of fate that had brought her to this moment. She wrote about the woman she had become, about the partnership she and Mason had forged, about the children they had raised and the land they had tamed together. And she wrote about love. Not the easy, romantic love of storybooks, but the real, complicated, enduring love that survived hardship and grew stronger with each passing year. The love that meant choosing each other every day, even when it was hard. The love that meant working side by side through drought and storm. The love that meant building something bigger than either of them could build alone. Emma set down her pen and closed the journal, then extinguished the lamp. Through the window, she could see the windmill silhouetted against the star-filled sky, still turning after all these years. She closed her eyes and listened to its familiar creak, to Mason's steady breathing beside her, to the sounds of her children sleeping in the next room. She had climbed a broken windmill and set it turning. And in doing so, she had set her whole life turning towards something beautiful and true. She had found her home, her purpose, her great love. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that she would not trade it for anything in the world. The desert wind sang outside, carrying the scent of sage and possibility, and Emma Fairchild Everett fell asleep with a smile on her lips, grateful beyond measure for every moment of the extraordinary life she had built. Years continued to unfold at the Windmill Ranch, each season bringing its own challenges and rewards. Emma watched her children grow into adults who embodied the best qualities of both their parents. Sarah, at 22, had married a young rancher from a neighboring property, and together they were building their own operation while still helping manage the Windmill Ranch. She had inherited Emma's independent spirit and Mason's steady reliability, and watching her daughter thrive filled Emma with a pride that sometimes brought tears to her eyes. Michael, at 19, had chosen to stay on the ranch full-time, taking over more and more of the day-to-day management as Mason's knees began to protest the long days in the saddle. He had a gift for breeding cattle, an eye for quality that had significantly improved their herd. He was courting a schoolteacher from Bodie, a smart young woman who reminded Emma a little of herself at that age. Emma herself, now 42, still worked the ranch alongside Mason, though they had learned to pace themselves better. The desert had etched lines around her eyes and weathered her skin, but she had never felt more beautiful or more alive. Mason, at 46, still made her heart skip when he smiled at her across the dinner table. His hair was graying now, and he moved a bit slower than he once had, but he was still the man who had helped her fix a broken windmill, still the man who treated her as an equal partner in all things. The windmill itself had become something of a legend in the area. Other ranchers came from miles around to see it, to ask Emma and Mason's advice on irrigation and water management. Emma had become an expert on windmill mechanics over the years, and she had helped design and build several others for neighboring ranches. It gave her deep satisfaction to share the knowledge she had gained, to help others the way Mason had once helped her. On a warm afternoon in late spring, Emma and Mason sat on the porch of their house, watching the cattle graze in the distance. They were alone, a rare occurrence these days, and they savored the quiet companionship that came from 2 decades of marriage. "I received a letter from my mother yesterday," Emma said. "She is turning 70 this year. She wants me to visit Philadelphia, bring the family. She says she wants to meet her grandchildren properly before she gets too old." Mason looked at her. "Do you want to go?" Emma considered the question. She had not been back to Philadelphia since leaving 21 years ago. She and her mother had maintained a correspondence over the years, the relationship slowly healing from the rift Emma's departure had caused. Her sisters wrote occasionally, their letters full of news about their own families, their comfortable but constrained lives. Emma had often wondered what they thought of her choices, whether they envied her freedom or pitied her hardship. "I think I do," Emma said slowly. "I think it would be good for the children to see where I came from, to understand that part of their heritage. And I think it would be good for my mother to see what I built, to understand why I left." "Then we will go," Mason said simply. "This summer, after the spring calving is done and before we need to move the herd to higher pasture, we can leave Michael in charge. He is more than ready." So in July of 1902, the Everett family boarded a train in Carson City and traveled east. It was Emma's first time on a train since her journey west, and she marveled at how much faster and more comfortable the trip was compared to the stagecoach rides of her youth. Sarah and her husband had decided to stay and help Michael manage the ranch, but Emma brought Michael with her, wanting him to see the world beyond the desert. Philadelphia struck Emma as impossibly crowded and loud after 21 years in the open spaces of the West. The buildings seemed to press in from all sides, and the noise of traffic and people was overwhelming. But it was also beautiful in its way, with its tree-lined streets and grand architecture, and Emma found herself appreciating both worlds, the one she had left and the one she had chosen. Her mother lived in the same house Emma had grown up in, though it seemed smaller now, less imposing. When the door opened and Emma saw her mother's face, now lined and framed with white hair, she felt a rush of emotion that surprised her. They had been estranged for so long, connected only by occasional letters, but blood was blood and love could survive even long separation. "Emma," her mother breathed. "Oh, my dear girl, let me look at you." Emma submitted to her mother's scrutiny, knowing what she would see. A woman weathered by sun and work, dressed simply, with calluses on her hands and confidence in her bearing. Not the delicate lady her mother had tried to raise, but something else entirely. Something stronger. "You look well," her mother said finally, and there was surprise in her voice. "You look happy." "I am, Mother. I truly am." Her mother turned her attention to Mason and Michael, and Emma watched as her genteel mother met her cowboy husband and rancher son. Mason was polite and respectful, but he did not pretend to be something he was not. He was a Western man, plain-spoken and direct, and Emma held her breath wondering how her mother would react. But her mother surprised her. She welcomed Mason warmly, thanked him for taking care of her daughter, and told him she could see that Emma had chosen well. She fussed over Michael, marveling at how tall and handsome he was, and Michael bore it with good-natured patience. Over the next 2 weeks, Emma showed her family the city of her childhood. They visited Independence Hall and the bustling markets, attended a concert and a play. Emma's sisters came to visit with their families, and there was awkwardness at first, the gulf of years and choices between them. But slowly, they found common ground in their children, in memories of their shared childhood, in the love that still existed beneath the layers of time and distance. Emma told them about the ranch, about fixing the windmill, about building a life from nothing. She told them about learning to ride and rope, about delivering calves in the middle of the night, about droughts and hard winters and moments of breathtaking beauty. Her sisters listened with expressions that Emma could not quite read, a mixture of incomprehension and perhaps a little envy. "Are you happy?" her younger sister Margaret asked one afternoon when they were alone. "Truly happy. It sounds like such a hard life." "It is hard," Emma admitted. "But it is also rewarding in ways I never imagined. I matter there, Margaret. The work I do matters. The decisions I make have real consequences, and Mason treats me as an equal partner, not as a decoration or a servant. I have never felt more valued or more alive." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "I think I understand. I think perhaps you made the right choice, even if it is not a choice I could have made." On their last evening in Philadelphia, Emma's mother took her aside into the small garden behind the house. They sat on a bench under an old maple tree, and her mother took Emma's hands in her own. "I was so angry when you left," her mother said quietly. "I thought you were throwing away your life, your opportunities. I thought you would come home within months, defeated and sorry. But you did not. And now I see what you built, see who you became, and I realize I was wrong." Emma felt tears prick her eyes. "Mother, let me finish." Her mother squeezed her hands. "I was wrong to try to force you into a life that did not fit. You knew yourself better than I knew you. You were brave enough to choose your own path, and you succeeded beyond anything I could have imagined. I am proud of you, Emma. I should have said that years ago, but I am saying it now. I am so very proud of you." Emma let the tears fall then, and she embraced her mother tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for saying that." They stayed like that for a long time, mother and daughter, separated by years and miles and choices, but connected still by love. When they finally pulled apart, Emma's mother smiled. "Your Mason is a good man. I can see how much he loves you, how much he respects you. That is what I always wanted for you, even if I did not realize it at the time." "He is the best man I have ever known," Emma said simply. The trip back west felt like coming home in the truest sense. As the train carried them across the country, Emma watched the landscape change from green and cultivated to brown and wild, and her heart lifted. She loved Philadelphia, loved her family, but this was where she belonged. In the wide open spaces, in the harsh and beautiful desert, in the life she had built with her own hands. When they finally arrived back at the Windmill Ranch, Emma stood in the yard and looked up at the windmill turning against the brilliant blue sky. Mason came to stand beside her, his arm around her waist, and they stood together in comfortable silence. "It is good to be home," Emma said. "It is always good when you are here," Mason replied. That night, lying in their bed with the desert wind singing outside, Emma reflected on how far she had come. She had traveled east and come back west again, and in doing so had closed a circle. She had made peace with her past, with her mother, with the life she had chosen to leave. And she had returned to the life she had chosen to build, more certain than ever that she had made the right choice. The years continued to flow like water through the windmill's pump, steady and unstaining. Emma and Mason grew older together, their hair turning silver, their bodies moving more slowly, but their love never diminishing. They watched their children have children, saw the Windmill Ranch pass to the next generation, saw the legacy they had built take root and grow. Sarah's children learned to climb the windmill just as their grandmother had, and Emma taught them how to maintain it, how to understand its mechanisms. Michael's children learned to manage cattle and horses, carrying on the traditions their grandfather had established. The Windmill Ranch became a family enterprise spanning generations. each adding their own contributions while honoring what had come before. On their 40th wedding anniversary, Mason took Emma's hand and led her out to the windmill one final time. They were both in their 60s now, and the climb was harder than it had been, but they managed it together, helping each other up the ladder rungs they had climbed so many times before. On the platform, with the desert spreading out below them in all its harsh beauty, Mason turned to Emma and took both her hands. 40 years ago, I watched you climb this broken windmill, he said. I watched you attack an impossible task with nothing but determination and courage. And I knew in that moment that I was looking at the woman I would love for the rest of my life. Every year since has only confirmed that truth. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Emma Everett. You are my partner, my love, my best friend. Thank you for 40 years of happiness. Emma felt tears stream down her weathered cheeks. You gave me a life I never dared to dream of. You gave me freedom and partnership and love that never tried to change me or constrain me. You gave me this beautiful life. Thank you, Mason. Thank you for helping me fix the windmill, for helping me build all of this. Thank you for every single day. They kissed as the wind caught the windmill blades and sent them spinning, the sun warm on their faces. Their children and grandchildren gathered in the yard below. The windmill turned as it had for 40 years, steady and reliable, a testament to what could be built when two people worked together toward a common dream. As they climbed down for the last time, their grandchildren cheering and applauding, Emma knew that this was the happily ever after she had never expected but always deserved. Not a fairy tale ending where everything was easy, but something better. A real ending, earned through hard work and love and partnership. An ending that was really just another beginning as their legacy passed to the next generation. That evening, surrounded by family at a celebration dinner, Emma looked around the table at the faces she loved most in the world. Mason sat beside her, his hand warm in hers. Sarah and Michael and their spouses and children filled the room with noise and laughter and love. The house she and Mason had built together rang with life and joy. Emma thought about the young woman she had been, standing in a dusty yard staring at a broken windmill, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. She thought about the choice she had made to climb that windmill, to fix it herself, to prove that she could make this life work. And she thought about the cowboy who had ridden up and offered to help, who had looked at her with sage-colored eyes and seen not a woman who needed to be saved, but a partner worth building a life with. It had not been easy. There had been droughts and illnesses, harsh winters and financial struggles, moments when Emma had wondered if they would make it. But they had made it together, and in doing so had created something beautiful and lasting. As the party wound down and the grandchildren were tucked into beds throughout the house, Emma and Mason stepped out onto the porch one last time. The windmill turned in the darkness, its familiar creak, a lullaby they had heard for 40 years. The desert stretched out under a sky full of stars, infinite and eternal. "No regrets?" Mason asked softly. "Not a single one," Emma replied. They stood together in the darkness, these two people who had chosen each other and built a life that mattered. They had fixed a broken windmill and set it turning. And in doing so, they had set their whole world turning toward love and partnership, and a happiness that had lasted a lifetime. The windmill turned on through the night, through the years, through the generations that followed. It stood as a monument not just to the water it pumped or the cattle it sustained, but to the love story that had begun when a determined woman climbed a broken structure and a cowboy stared up and lost his heart. It turned as their children grew old and their grandchildren had children of their own. It turned as the West changed around it, as the wild frontier became settled land, as the old ways gave way to the new. But some things remained constant. The desert wind still blew across the high valleys. The mountains still rose against the sky. And the Windmill Ranch, built by Emma and Mason Everett, endured as a testament to what two people could create when they chose to build together. Emma lived to see her great-grandchildren, to see the ranch prosper and grow beyond her wildest imaginings. She lived to be 82 years old, still sharp and capable until nearly the end. When she finally passed, peacefully in her sleep with Mason holding her hand, it was as though the desert itself mourned. The whole community turned out for her funeral, 3 generations of people she had touched and influenced. Mason followed her 2 years later, unable to exist for long without his partner of more than 6 decades. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a simple headstone that read, Emma and Mason Everett. They built something beautiful together. The windmill turned on, maintained by their descendants, a family that grew from the love of a woman who climbed a broken structure and a man who helped her fix it. And every time the wind caught the blades and sent them spinning, every time the pump brought water up from deep in the earth, it was as though Emma and Mason's love was still turning, still flowing, still sustaining the life they had created. This was their legacy. Not just land or cattle or buildings, but the knowledge that love could transform everything. That partnership was stronger than independence. That 2 people working together could build something that would last forever. The windmill turned and would keep turning, a monument to a love that began in dust and determination, and grew into something as eternal as the desert itself.